Hello, Jeff Zwerig here, and welcome again to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we look at fascinating scientific ideas and how they help equip you to be more confident sharing your faith. Today I'm joined by my friend and colleague AJ Roberts, and we're going to investigate what are the implications of talking about clever viruses. AJ, it's good to have you here.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to be here.
So I know you've had this shirt that you've worn in the past that is provocative. Why don't you tell us a little bit about this shirt, if you will?
So when I was in college, I actually was already fascinated with viruses, and I was doing a senior internship at a lab where we did viral diagnostics. And so while I was working at that lab, I got a T-shirt made that I would wear that said, "Viruses are people too." And I wore it, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, I wanted to catch people's attention.
Well, it certainly does that.
Yeah, I wanted to provoke people into sort of thinking and maybe laughing. But viruses are completely fascinating in the sense of how diverse they are from one another. And so like people, there's a large amount of diversity in the human population. And so that was one reason I wore it. Another is because I think we always want our research to be some of the most important research. And I think people who research things pertaining to life seem to think that their research is more important than people who research things that aren't pertaining to life. And so I sort of wanted to justify my field of interest by claiming that what I was studying were sort of like people.
With people, okay, yeah. So you're not saying they're people. That's an interesting story. But I guess what I find interesting out of that is this idea of how we talk about small life, if you will. I mean, people are clever. We come up with ingenious ideas. But that language seems to kind of permeate how we talk about bacterial life as well. So where does that play out, and why does that show up so much?
That's a great question. And actually, I sort of changed my attitude about how I wanted people to think about viruses by the time I got to grad school. I started to develop a pet peeve when people would use language like you're talking about to make bacteria or viruses or molecules clever or selfish, or endow them with the ability to evade the immune system or to attack a cell. And one of the reasons,
why so? What was the change?
Yeah, one of the reasons is because it's just highly unscientific language, right? The molecules aren't actually volitional. They aren't actually self-directing their own fate and outcome. They don't have that complexity of ability. And so I actually see it now as sort of language that people use to make their work sound more interesting, like I did, but also they're trying to, I think, account for secondary causes that in an evolutionary-based system don't have anything that's directing them towards a goal. They still find that things act very much like they have purpose or are goal-oriented.
Well, give us an example of that, because I do find that language of selfish and clever, those are very human attributes that where we're making decisions to do certain kinds of things. And obviously bacteria and molecules don't have that reasoning ability, but what are some of the examples of why do they use this kind of language?
So certainly in the case of viruses, viruses, they mutate, and that mutations occur usually from errors in replicating the genome of the virus. And so the immune system is targeting specific viral proteins, and when viruses mutate, it changes the amino acids in the protein, and when those amino acids in the protein become different enough that the immune system no longer recognizes that protein, it's attributing that result as the virus being clever in order to evade the immune system. But what's really happening is there are non-teleological, non-goal-oriented mutations taking place, and only the ones that end up evading the immune system persist in the organism. And so the winner, if you will, has the characteristic of something that evaded, when in fact it was just secondary causes failing to recognize what had already been there.
You know, that's interesting, because it sounds like you're using language for the organism, the virus or the bacteria, if you will, that almost points towards an intentionality or design in how those organisms work, which is something completely outside of the organism.
That's right. That's right. Right. I mean, there is that sense of things seem to be working in concert with one another, right? They seem to be working in a way that suggests that there's immense design or engineering feat. And I think that, certainly our perspective as old earth or progressive creationists, we know that God endowed nature with these abilities to be able to thrive under a variety of environmental conditions. And so those adaptations, those mutations, they make perfect sense in sort of the narrative we tell. But in an evolutionary narrative where it's only secondary causes and unguided mutations, there's still this very strong sense of purpose and goal. And so they have to account for it somehow, and they use anthropomorphic language that sort of endows inanimate objects with human characteristics. Yeah.
Well, okay, so let me ask this question. I agree with you very much, obviously, that things that look designed or this language reflects that there is a design or a purpose or an intentionality, or at least that's a reasonable thing. How would you use that sort of discussion? Where would it come up where you might be able to use that to bring the gospel into the conversation?
Yeah, I think that I would use it probably along the tact where when we're talking about things like viruses or bacteria or molecules that don't have the ability to make choices, we still want to talk about it in those terms because there's something reflected in nature that is pointing towards purpose. And the other reason is that evolutionists or naturalists who are trying to sort of convey their scientific findings to the general public, they want to do it in such a way that captivates us, right? And we're people of story. And I think when we recognize that we're people of story, and story is something that entails purpose, and it entails goals, right? It entails a plot. I think that that's very deeply ingrained in us, and I think that that also points to a creator. It points to us being people of story that are embedded in story, and we want to hear stories, and we want to tell stories, and I think that that's a very powerful inroad to the gospel.
So in some sense, and I need a kind of a quick answer here, but it seems like if we become adept in understanding what the science has to say, there's plenty of detail there that gives us the story that is a more compelling story than anybody else has to say.
It is a story of purpose, and I think each and every one of us longs deeply for purpose.
Yeah. Well, thanks, AJ. I appreciate your comments. It really is true that when we look at the details of how creation works, particularly that pertaining to life, we see abundant evidence of purpose, intentionality, and design. And that makes great sense if there's a creator who fashioned it all for us to enjoy and to know him more as we study it. I'd encourage you to go to reasons.org and look for AJ's blog, Viruses Are People Too, so that you can learn more about how we use this human-like language to describe the intricacies of life and how we can use that to go share the gospel with others.